We're very honored to have with us Dr. Ramin Khadem, who basically has been involved in space for much of his working life. He was one of the founders and former chief financial officer of Inmarsat PLC, which I believe was about satellites to measure the movement of shipping originally, but he will tell us that, no doubt. He's also served for many years as chairman of the Board of Trustees of the International Space University in France, and also has been chairman of Odyssey Moon Limited, which was a space exploration company, and also on the board of Soho China Limited as a non-executive director. Also on Mansat Limited and the International Institute of Space Commerce, a number of other enterprises. Currently, he's a trustee of the board of the Sir John Templeton Foundation, which is involved in encouraging better teaching of research in religious education. He has taught MBA courses at Tsinghua in Beijing and Fudan universities in Shanghai. Over to you, Ramin.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for this kind introduction, and greetings to all our dear participants. It's really a pleasure to spend the next hour with you from the corner of our kitchen in London with all of you in far off places in your respective homes. My dear wife, who will be assisting me with the slide, is in another room. So I guess I want you to know that we are keeping in full compliance and keeping with isolation, and I'm sure many others on this call are also mindful of the need to isolate and stay safe. I start with one of my favorite hidden words of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i Faith, which is in his Arabic compilation, number 40. This next slide, he says, "O son of man, wert thou to speed through the immensity of space and traverse the expanse of heaven, yet thou wouldst find no rest save in submission to our command and humbleness before our face." Let us dissect this a little. Let's start with the words submission to our command, which we also find in the beliefs of monotheistic religions such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which is obedience to God's commands. What is exceptional here, though, is the added contextual dimension of the space age we live in. He says, "Wert thou to speed through the immensity of space and traverse the expanse of heaven." Consider the compilation of the hidden words was revealed in 1858 when Baha'u'llah was in Baghdad, at a time when the thought of speeding through space must have been a sheer fantasy to the listener or reader of this passage. The fastest form of travel in that year was, in this next slide, a clipper class of sailing vessels, used also for carrying cargo, which with a good wind could surpass a steamship and do 18 knots or about 20 miles an hour. With that rate of movement, you can well imagine how baffled the readers of this hidden word would be. To consider speeding through space? So back to the hidden words. Now let's go to the substance of this brief statement, which delivers the crucial message that no matter where you may be in this immense space, you are bound by God's command, which includes his physical laws and his spiritual laws, and humbleness before God's face. Is that not his creation that is the manifestation of his face? In this next slide, it includes our own night sky shown here with all the dazzling planets and stars beyond. And this next slide, and the Milky Way galaxy where our sun is located. This next slide shows the Milky Way and where our solar system is in the lower center left in the yellow circle. I want to zoom in this lower circle on our next slide. Just see how tiny our solar system is. It is marked in yellow and it says solar system, you are here. Do you see that dot? That dot includes the sun, Earth, and all the planets revolving around the sun. That is where we are in this expanse. Now, our galaxy, what you're looking at, is home to a few 100 billion stars. And our sun is just one such star. And our Milky Way is just one galaxy amongst innumerable others. Now, what I think is really remarkable about Baha'u'llah's statement, is it does not matter where we happen to be in this expanse, or for that matter, other intelligent beings from other planets in another star system in our galaxy or another galaxy altogether, maybe. We are all submissive to his command. Wow, this realization is quite awesome and inspiring every time I think of it. For now and evermore, every creature, every intelligence that exists, and everything animate or inanimate in this vast expanse is submissive to his command, the Lord of the universe. Imagine, in 50, 100, or 500 years from now, when humans have found a way to traverse far into the galaxy, they are still in submission to his command and humbleness before his face. This I found truly transformative for me, providing just an infinitesimal glimpse into the awesome mind of the Creator and its creation. Here I need to correct myself, as Baha'is believe that God is unknowable and that we can never, ever comprehend the majesty of the infinite mind with our own limited, finite minds. All we can appreciate are the manifestations of his attributes through the messengers he has sent throughout the ages, such attributes as generosity, love, forgiveness, cooperation, reciprocity, unity, etc., etc. So I don't profess to know anything, but just surmise what might be possibly an interpretation of this hidden word of Baha'u'llah. And I could be totally wrong. That said, let's go to the revealed words of Baha'u'llah about nature in the Lohe Hikmat, or Tablet of Wisdom, in the next slide. Say, nature in its essence is the embodiment of my name, the maker, the creator. Its manifestations are diversified by varying causes. And in this diversity, there are signs for men of discernment. Nature is God's will and is its expression in and through the contingent world. It is a dispensation of providence ordained by the ordainer, the all-wise. So this vast universe we have seen without, in the images you've seen already, and this contingent world within, where we live on planet Earth, and the nature that surrounds us, down to the smallest of atoms, are embodiments of his name, the maker, the creator. That includes that little atom surrounded by a cloud of even tinier electrons, and quarks, which are even smaller and make up protons and neutrons, the fundamental building blocks of the universe. All are his handiwork. Literally, everything from the big, massive macro universe out there to the minutest micro building block on Earth, and every other heavenly planet, moon, and star is his. This is simply beyond our human understanding. How absolutely incredible and amazing. As my dear father used to often say, quoting from the Bible, "O Lord, increase my astonishment at thee." In the next slide, Baha'u'llah says, "Every time I lift up mine eyes unto thy heaven, I call to mind thy highness and thy loftiness, and thine incomparable glory and greatness. And every time I turn my gaze to thine earth, I'm made to recognize the evidences of thy power and the tokens of thy bounty. And when I behold the sea, I find that it speaketh to me of thy majesty. and of the potency of thy might, and of the sovereignty of thy sovereignty and thy grandeur. And whatever time I contemplate the mountains, I am led to discover the ensigns of thy victory and the standards of thine omnipotence. This passage from Baha'u'llah is packed with so much meaning. Lifting up his eyes unto thy heaven has spiritual dimensions which is beyond our comprehension, but in physical terms refers to the star-studded sky in space. And then he mentions gazing upon thine earth with the tokens of his bounty, with the majesty of the sea and the mountains, all provide a holistic view of all God's creation and our infinitesimal existence in its vastness. This profound view of earth and creation, we know, is at variance with the concepts during the Dark Ages, when the earth was considered flat rather than a sphere, and then at a later time when it was considered at the very center of the universe. And how could one have blamed people then? In this next slide, they saw the nighttime scene of the stars and the moon hanging in the sky for their show, and the daily sunrise and sunset in the next slide, and they thought, well, it was all about us. Sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and everything revolves around us. And so it was until Copernicus and later Galileo in the 16th century came along and through their observations concluded that the earth is not at the center with everything revolving around it, but the sun is, which was a shock to Christian theology of that time. The Catholic Church was not pleased and set up an inquisition. Galileo was to recant under pressure, but yet maintain his views as a devoted scientist. He was then put to house arrest until he died. Now we know man is not at the center of the universe and may not be particularly special in relation to all that exists in the cosmos. There are a lot of competing galaxies to ours. In the next slide, you see the picture of Andromeda, another galaxy the size of ours, which was reported recently based on images from the Hubble Space Telescope, to be on a direct path to ours. Andromeda is on the left and our Milky Way to the right. So that is pretty bad news, as the crash would create unimaginable havoc and destruction. The good news is that it won't happen for another 3.75 billion years. Now, in the next slide, thanks to the wonderful Hubble telescope, in 2016, it had found 10 times more galaxies than previously thought to have existed, now estimated to be 200 billion. Simply impossible to comprehend. And guess what? With improved telescope technology, we're told up to 2 trillion galaxies may become observable only from our corner of the universe. That corner that was in that yellow circle we saw earlier. Based on NASA findings in 2015, using the Kepler Space Telescope, there are at least 1 billion Earths in our galaxy alone. We're talking about 1 billion or more rocky planets that are approximately the size of the Earth and are orbiting familiar-looking yellow sunshine stars like ours. Imagine if only a minute percentage of these billion can harbor life. How many Earth-like civilizations might be out there? So we could be one amongst thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands that have special conditions of being in the so-called Goldilocks zone, that is having water and the right temperature range for an atmosphere and for life and vegetation to exist. That said, I'm not suggesting for a minute that the Earth is not special. It is absolutely. It is the only homeland we know and a very precious one to protect and sustain for future generations. A remarkable thing is that Baha'u'llah provided guidance. For those of you who are new to the Baha'i Faith, he wrote over 100 volumes of books on a range of diverse topics. So there's an amazing wealth of information and knowledge on a variety of topics which is unprecedented in religious history. I urge those of you who are interested to dig deeply into his writings. He says in his gleanings more than 150 years ago, next slide, the learned men that have fixed at several thousand years the life of this earth have failed throughout the long period of their observation to consider either the number or the age of other planets. Consider, moreover, the manifold divergencies that have resulted from the theories propounded by these men. Know thou that every fixed star had its own planets, and every planet its own creatures, whose number no man can compute. So for Baha'is, it's clear that we're not alone in this vast universe. And that while all the efforts at search in this next slide for extraterrestrial intelligence, such as SETI, which stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, are welcome, the fact that massive receiving dishes that are pointed skywards have not received bursts of data that is understandable to us does not negate the existence of intelligence out there. SETI scientists are now searching for so-called techno-signatures, using cutting-edge instruments and employing quantum computers with world's most powerful telescopes to reach out further to distant stars in our neighborhood of the universe. Looking for that needle of intelligence in the haystack, as the familiar expression goes, to sift through the signals, all of the signals received to more cleverly find out important clues. And by the way, that neighborhood is really large, given the infinite size of the universe that, by the way, we are told is expanding, which raises the conundrum, an expanding infinite universe? So it seems. Just to appreciate the distances, let's look at this next slide. This chart, courtesy of NASA, shows how many light years we are away from other heavenly bodies and spaces. Top left is the sun, and the bottom right is the furthest galaxy in this example. Now, a light year is the distance light travels in 1 Earth year. Light travels at approximately 186,000 miles per second. So in 1 year, it will travel about 6 trillion miles. That is 6 with 12 zeros after it. So while the light that leaves the sun reaches us in 8.3 minutes, at the other extreme shown bottom right, galaxy GNZ11 found at the edge of the universe, which we know has no edge, of course, but anyway, edge of the universe is 13.4 billion light years away. So that light from that galaxy reaching us now left 13.4 billion years ago. So what we see in the night sky is history. And in some cases, really, really ancient history. The fastest mankind has sent things to space was a Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, which reached speeds of 35,000 miles per hour. At that speed, it will take 100 years to go 1 light year. But what we traveled at the fastest humans have ever traveled, such as on Space Shuttle Discovery or on SpaceX, well, that is about 17,500 miles per hour. And it would take 200 years to achieve 1 light year. To cross our galaxy to its center, which is 26,000 light years away, and you see that in the middle of that slide, it would take 5,200,000 Earth years at the best speed we have achieved so far. So very humbling to fathom all this. Now, let me say the aim of my talk tonight is not to delve further into such weighty cosmic topics, much of which is well beyond my own understanding, but rather to provide a background of why all of this is relevant, perhaps even crucial to the stage of evolution of life on our planet, and what it forebodes for our future. My interest in space was quite accidental. It actually began way back when I was a child in Iran. I recall one day my uncle discussing with my father this amazing proposition he had read about a British scientist who says that if you manage to put relay stations at a specific location in space, you could transmit signals from one part of the world to another, and people can simultaneously hear and see each other. How could this be possible? I heard them say. And I was fascinated and intrigued as a little boy. In a paper published in 1945 in Wireless World, in fact, Arthur C. Clarke had predicted the future of geostationary satellite communications. Basically, he argued that relay stations placed directly above the equator at particular distance could remain fixed or be geostationary over that same point on the Earth's equator, and could act as a relay station to bounce beams from anywhere under its coverage back to Earth. I'll go through this in the next slide and promise it is the only one that is a bit complicated with formulas, and I hope not to lose anyone. So in the next slide, here you see a busy slide. At the top left, an extract of Arthur C. Clarke's paper saying under the diagram there, 3 satellite stations would provide global coverage. Station 1, 2, and 3 are the geostationary orbit beam, and from there the beams go to the Earth, middle of the Earth. So that's on the left-hand side. But the key question is, where should they be placed? So the formula on the top right in the highlighted blue box provides the secret. Using Newtonian physics, a formula for the gravitational attraction between 2 bodies, shown on the right-hand side, to equal the centripetal force, or the force that turns, from a satellite revolving around the Earth on the left-hand side, setting this to be equal, we can derive the distance if we set these to be the same. In other words, the force of one cancels the force of the other, and the satellite remains in fixed position. Now, I'll go through this explanation a little further. M1 is the mass of a satellite, M2 is the mass of Earth, both are known. G is the gravitational constant derived by Newton, which applies universally, and V is the velocity or speed of rotation of the satellites, which is again known. The only unknown in this formula on the right-hand side at the top is R, which is the distance between the centers of the masses of the Earth and the satellite that was going to be put up. And that needs to be derived. For those of you with physics or maths background, this is straightforward. We have one unknown variable, R, and the rest are all provided. So we can derive R. Now, once R is derived, which is shown as capital R at the bottom of that slide, and referred to as R orbit in the lower part of the slide, we need to subtract the distance from the center of the Earth to the surface, or the radius, referred to as R Earth, from R orbit, to arrive at the height H where the satellite needs to be placed. And that is 35,600 kilometers over the equator. At that point, the object would be stationary, or better put, geostationary relative to the movement of the Earth. Amazing what human minds can accomplish, isn't it? It's just extraordinary, and a topic for another discussion, perhaps. So at a distance of approximately, let's round it up, 36,000 kilometers, lo and behold, 3 of these satellites placed above the equator around the globe would be in constant geostationary orbit, meaning they would remain fixed relative to the Earth's rotation and provide global coverage. Now, less than 20 years later, the first communication satellite was put in orbit. I recall in 1962 watching in America with my dear father on a TV screen in a gym we had gone to for exercise with my dear brother, a live transmission which featured John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, and Yves Montand, the French singer, being broadcast to audiences in the United States and Europe. My dear wife is going to show you now 2 short clips to relive that period. So just, you will have to wait for her to load her system there. We found that it takes a while to get these things done. So sitting glued to the TV, we watched these two clips, which our father remarked how amazing that this had come to pass. It was a seminal moment in his life and mine as well, as I remember that day many years ago when I was a child and my father and uncle having that discussion. My father also referenced an Islamic hadith that was incomprehensible until then, that at the end of times, people in one part of the world will see and hear others in another part without having to travel there. That experience led me eventually into the field of telecommunication after my university studies, and then to satellite communications. You already have heard about that through the introduction by Stephen. Thank you. So I want to actually share with you now a satellite that was built by the company while I was employed there. In next slide, you will see this quite massive satellite with foldable solar panels and antennas that are only deployed in space, of course, and once it gets there. The entire size of this satellite, which was also the picture on our Zoom announcement, is just short of a football pitch. So you can see how big this is. It's massive. And it's obviously put up by large rockets like this one, which you see in this slide. So the compact satellite sits in the nose fairing of the rocket at the very top to be deployed in space. This sequence involves a number of stages shown on the right. I show it for those interested, and I'll spare going into too much details because it's actually in small print. I don't want to lose anyone. But as you can see, I'm still fascinated by what mankind's accomplishments are in this area. This shows the sequence of events in the launch and separation. So after launch, you see the rocket motors, once they have exhausted their fuel, separate and fall away in number 2 on the right-hand side into the ocean. In this example, you might have heard that SpaceX, a company founded by Elon Musk, successfully brings those boosters back to the launch pad from which they are launched, which is both a huge saving for a subsequent launch and for the environment. This is a significant advance on the prior approach of dumping the first stage at sea, like in this picture, or on land, which was the case with the Russian launches from Baikonur in Kazakhstan in Central Asia. The separation of the payload which carries the satellite happens in the final stage, here shown as number 6. So that is the container that's put in orbit, injected in space, that carries the satellite, the antennas, and everything else. I'm sorry the image is too small, but I hope if you're interested, you could check it up online. Thereafter, it'll be put into geostationary orbit, which is the 36,000 kilometers in space we talked about earlier. It'll be tested out. The solar panels will be unfurled. They're actually compressed to the main body of the satellite. And by the way, the satellite is the size of a double-decker London bus, so it's big. And then they separate and they fold out, and effectively those become the solar panels. Now, here's one of these satellites, and if you look at this next slide, which was commissioned for service providing coverage for all sorts of applications over all of Europe, Africa, and Middle East, to planes, ships, and land for a variety of purposes. The signals, the satellite signals, excuse me, are broadcast without any restrictions. Even if there were restrictions placed in place by nations, electromagnetic waves would not comprehend it and go right through the boundaries. Seeing the world from this perspective challenges our notions of national regional demarcations, all of which are arbitrary and artificial. Now, COVID-19, the smallest of humankind's enemy, has really brought this home, isn't it? Really interesting that this tiniest of all enemies should be responsible in the midst of the havoc it has created to also teach us a lesson, or maybe be of some service. And that's being, there is no distinction amongst us, high or low, rich or poor, or from whatever background we may come from. We are all exposed, and there's no place to hide. Oddly enough, it is like electromagnetic waves and the rays of the sun that do not discriminate based on boundaries, gender, class, or creed. They cast their benefits and vengeance, in the case of COVID, on all equally. Now, back to our discussion of satellites seeing no national demarcations. In this next slide, I want to share a couple of stories that touched me during my years dealing with space and satellite projects. One is to do with the astronaut Joe Engle, who flew several missions on a space shuttle. He came for a visit to our London headquarters, and we had a reception for him. He described his first launch atop the shuttle as it was about to take off. As you can see, the shuttle was strapped to solid rocket boosters, and as he sat vertically within seconds of takeoff, he said, "I looked out the window and I saw the Earth without boundaries." I'll never forget it. He said it with a Kansas drawl. "I'm no sentimental slob," he said, "but I tell you, when I saw the Earth without geographic boundaries, I had a lump in my throat. I knew that those boundaries are all in maps, but it just hit me. Where are the boundaries that divide us? We are one," he said. I can tell you, my experience of Joe Engle was his utter humility. I also felt a serenity and calmness that I noticed with others who had gone to space, including cosmonauts I was privileged to meet. There are many stories to tell, but I will spare the time and I'll just tell you one other story. When in Philadelphia years ago, I had lunch with Rick Hawk, another astronaut who had flown a number of shuttle missions and later became CEO of Access Space. Over this dessert, I asked him if he had any special experiences or spiritual feelings while in space. He said that he was not a religious person, but did have an experience that was quite moving. I asked him to share it with me. When he flew, in this next slide, you see his first mission, STS-7, the seventh flight of the space shuttle. He said it was nighttime, and with every rotation of about 88 minutes around the Earth, as he approached the US, he looked for the lights coming from his home in California, looking for the city of Long Beach. After his third or fourth revolution, he suddenly had a deep realization. Why am I looking for my home city? Every light that emanates from Earth is where people live, and this entire planet is my home. That was a powerful experience, he said, that lasted him all his life. Here's what Baha'u'llah said over 150 years ago in this next slide. "This span of earth is but one homeland and one habitation. It behooveth you to abandon vainglory which causeth alienation, and to set your hearts on whatever will ensure harmony." I think the serenity and humility of these folks is perhaps because when in space, they abandoned vainglory and saw the world as one habitation, and therefore had a transformational experience like none other on Earth. Many of us who will never have the experience of space travel are nonetheless affected by images taken from space. Arguably, the single biggest impact on our global awareness was seeing Earthrise, the face of the Earth from space as photographed by Apollo 8 astronaut William Andrews. You see it in this next slide. This image from space of our common homeland has had an enormous impact on peoples across all backgrounds, cultures, and nationalities, without exception. And of course, the first moon landing of Apollo 11, who can ever forget that? That experience is just magnificent. Those astronauts who actually went to the moon virtually all had an extraordinary life-changing experience. Their story is told in a book called Overview Effect by Frank White. He interviewed those who saw the planet from the moon or on their return to Earth. Eugene Cernan, as the last man on the moon in 1972, typified the experience of many others when he said, "I stood in awe on the lunar surface, too beautiful to grasp, against the black sky and the Earth in full view." He thought to himself there was too much logic, too much purpose for it to have happened by accident, and had a sense of the underlying purpose and the hand of God being at work. He said it was the deepest, most emotional experience of his life. In this next slide, you see the image taken in 1972, which became known as the Blue Marble. Another astronaut, Edgar Mitchell, on the way back from the moon, viewing the Earth, had an explosion of awareness. He called it an aha moment, a revelation that the universe is composed of a spirit and matter that are not separate, and that the bridge between the two is consciousness, that God is a universal consciousness manifested in each individual, and the route to divine and material reality is through this human consciousness. Michael Collins, another astronaut, was ecstatic from the experience he had, but he said the pity is that so far the view from 100,000 miles is the property of a handful of test pilots, rather than world leaders who need to see this perspective, realize the planet we share unites us in far more important ways than differences of skin color, religion, or economic system that divide us. He called it the most emotional and spiritual experience of his life. What was most singular about their experience was a sense of awe, of something incomprehensible and sublime, which led to wonderment, trying to explain a view and a phenomenon in a setting and framework totally foreign to them, with a life-changing impact, leading on to curiosity and ultimately to humility, a sense of total insignificance in the sheer vastness of the universe and the Creator's handiwork. A number of years ago, the John Templeton Foundation supported a grant on space, science, and spirituality, which produced some fascinating findings in this regard. The remarkable thing is that these feelings were replicated by others, including the Russians and Chinese on their missions. And those Russian and Americans on the International Space Station who spent long missions together working in space in perfect harmony commented how totally unconscious they were of their nationalities. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could send our world leaders to space to experience that same feeling, to abandon extreme nationalism and appreciate what truly binds us together? One astronaut, in fact, has actively promoted having a summit of leaders in space as crucial to their bonding between themselves and deriving a shared vision of our planet from a common vantage point that could lead to important decisions affecting humanity. And here in the next slide is what the Master Abdul Baha says about what truly binds us together. Love is the most great law that ruleth this mighty and heavenly cycle. The unique power that binds us together, the diverse elements of this material world. The supreme magnetic force that directeth the movements of the spheres in the celestial realms. So it is love, the supreme magnetic force that rules the universe. Now, I want to take you a little bit further and deeper in space. The deeper we go, the more the realization of this cosmic love referred to by Abdul Baha. Breaking the bounds of Earth seems to have a profound impact on one's outlook. Detached from the gravity that attracts us to the Mother Earth here, seems to also detach us from earthly things and more aware of our place in the universe. This has been borne out by those who went to the moon versus those who flew in low Earth orbit on the space shuttle we discussed earlier. It also seems to enhance our spiritual sensitivities and perceptions of observing the universe holistically and contemplate our place within it. The feeling of unity with the whole, of the planet just floating in space with nothing around it, are really life-changing experiences. For those of us who experienced our first plane ride, that was just the starting point of seeing the majesty of the earth below with the cities, the mountains, valleys, and seas, etc. The further out we go, the more we see our homeland in a loving, caring, and detached way. A fragile sphere hanging in space, protected by only a wafer-thin layer of atmosphere. Without that wafer-thin layer, life would cease to exist. Here in the next slide, we have the image of the pale blue dot, which the legendary Carl Sagan, the planetary scientist, cosmologist, and poet, coined, showing planet Earth as a speck in the picture taken from NASA's Voyager 1 space probe. Can you see that pale spot on that highlighted ray running from top to bottom? There it is. That was the great Carl Sagan, who was instrumental to the Voyager program. And the next slide, I want to show you that program, which was launched in September 1977. This is Voyager 1, which is some 14 billion miles away from Earth, traveling at a speed of 35,000 miles per hour. After some 43 years of traveling, it is well past Jupiter and Saturn and their moons, which it has photographed, and is the furthest human-made object from Earth and the only spacecraft to reach interstellar space so far. That is the space between our solar system and the next closest, which is Proxima Centauri. Now, as it traverses, it is still under the influence of our solar system as the sun's influence continues into the interstellar domain. But the gravitational attractions begin to diminish. Space becomes darker and darker until it emerges under the influence of Proxima Centauri. How long will this take? At the speed it is traveling, another 73,000 years. And the next slide, you see this again of the Voyager 1. It carries on its body a gold-plated copper disc for extraterrestrials who might find the spacecraft, with greetings in 55 languages and sounds and images of life on Earth, including sounds of laughter and examples of music from Mozart and Bach to jazz and modern pop. Now, can you imagine one day, in a distant future, some intelligence within the sphere of Proxima Centauri finding this object, this probe? It'll be the year 74977. Remember, it takes 73,000 years to get there, and was launched in 1977. What will that intelligence think of planet Earth in the year 1977? It's fascinating. I suppose it depends how advanced that intelligence may be itself then. Or perhaps planet Earth would have made advances that are beyond our wildest imagination. And some may say, if it lasts that long, that is planet Earth. Well, as Baha'is, we're very optimistic it will find its way forward. Baha'u'llah predicts that we have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. By the way, for those of you interested in tracking the mission of Voyager 1, I have the link and I can provide that to you over the discussion later. It's really marvelous to see how it's doing in real time. As many of you know, signs of life have been found in our own solar system, including hydrogen and water that could support life. And in fact, more recently, last week, there was a report that there's water on the lunar surface, which was actually known previously to exist as water ice in the polar shadowed regions. In 2009, in fact, NASA's Lacrosse probe found plentiful water ice in the southern polar region, which is always covered in shade or shadow, but it's ice, water ice. And it sent a probe and crashed into it. I was very fortunate to observe it. And it was really a needed proof for the future human colonies that could be settled on the moon. Now, NASA's Cassini spacecraft in 2015 took a deep dive into the rings of Saturn. Amongst the many moons of Saturn, in this next slide, it found Enceladus. Now, this is interesting. This Enceladus actually has watery plumes rising from its surface, as you can see in this picture. This significant finding means some form of life exists on Enceladus. And the Saturn's largest moon, Titan, which was also pictured by Cassini in this next slide, it is an icy world whose surface is obscured by a golden, hazy atmosphere and believed to harbor some form of life beneath, with lakes and seas and atmosphere, which is interesting, but unfortunately mostly made of nitrogen. Now, this next slide shows a picture taken by Cassini looking back on Earth. You can see Cassini's rings, Saturn's rings, and in the distance below right, the white dot, which is planet Earth. This picture has really touched me a lot. I've looked at it and fascinating. I've gone through a thought experiment, which I'm going to share with you. Isn't it wonderful? We have this imagination bestowed on humans that can visualize circumstances with our mind's eye, travel through time and back and forth, and something that my better half knows far more about it than I do. But imagine, and I know this is a stretch, but no problem as we're only playing with thought experiments. Suppose an intelligent life that exists out there on the moons of either Enceladus or Titan. And you were to tell him, look, you see that faint dot? That is planet Earth, a world full of life, with amazing greenery and beauty, but with one serious fault. It is a planet with internal conflict and turmoil. One part of that little dot is fighting another part, sending missiles across artificial borders they have carved up, and threatening the other side to agree to its agenda or face the consequences. Just imagine how this advanced, intelligent life might react. What? Are they savages? Not having learned to live in harmony together? This internal conflict brings to mind the Master Abdul Baha's comparing the world, our planet, to the human body. He says, and these are my own words, if one part of the body is in conflict with another part and not in harmony with the central command of the brain, that body will end up destroying itself. Even if under the central command of the brain, one part of the body is afflicted with a malady, no matter how well the other organs work, the entire body becomes affected. So we know this from our own experience with serious illnesses, or even with a toothache or a bad headache. Now, to be sure, advances have been made in that little dot over the tens of thousands of years. So let's be fair. Having progressed from inhabitants of caves to villages to towns and cities and nation states. But since the 19th century, we have stalled and not advanced beyond the nation state. In fact, we have had advances in medicine, science, technology, amazingly, throughout the period, which has propelled mankind to such heights that, in fact, the commissioner of the U.S. Patent Office in 1889 was quoted as saying that the patent office would soon shrink in size and eventually close, because everything that can be invented has been invented. Well, the explosion of new inventions, from the steamship to electricity to the telephone, completely transformed society well into the 1900s, and air travel and satellite and space exploration followed. With it, the stage was set for a gradual awareness of our planet as our home. That little dot has yet to make the final stride of seeing the world as one country and mankind its citizens, as Baha'u'llah proclaimed what was needed 150 years ago. Because the serious problems we face today are all global in nature. Apart from the pandemic, extremes of inequality is one that besets not only countries, but the world. Racial, religious, and other forms of discrimination are others. The cry for racial equality in the Black Lives Matter became a global phenomenon. Never before have there been such solidarity amongst vast stretches of humanity across all continents and all socioeconomic groups for justice and equity. The realization that we're one as humans with identical hopes and aspirations and similar needs on this planet is gaining momentum and is irreversible. Not to be forgotten is climate change, which may well be the most challenging of all issues we face. It is becoming abundantly clear what is needed is addressing our problems from a global perspective with effective global governance. As an aside, worth pointing out that the concern about our Earth and its ecology was significantly raised following those images of the planet in the 1970s. So therefore, another great contribution of the space age to the realization of our oneness and the care needed for our environment. In the next slide, we hear Baha'u'llah saying, the well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. Only when unity is firmly established to see the world as one whole can we enjoy well-being, peace, and security everywhere. This appears to be a tall order, but it will come to pass as more and more people realize what must be done. I believe the pandemic, the extreme weather, and the forest fires that has jolted many people and it has caused a change in perceptions and a demand in dealing with such challenges more inclusively. The worldwide Baha'i community, under the supervision of the Supreme Body, the Universal House of Justice, has for many years actively promulgating education and training of children and youth with children's classes and youth and adult workshops and community building programs at the local, national, and international levels to bring the realization of our responsibilities as global citizens, wherever we may live. It is truly remarkable that the involvement of Baha'is has taken place throughout the world with such fervor and focus that it has uplifted, in many cases, the discourse at national levels. In this next slide, Baha'u'llah's exhortation to his followers is, be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age ye live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. Which today means that Baha'is must continue to find every means of promoting the principles of the oneness of mankind, which is sorely needed, and which is the cornerstone around which all principles of the faith revolve. Shawi Effendi, the great-grandson of Baha'u'llah, points further to the consciousness of world citizenship, the founding of a world civilization and culture as the initial stages of a golden period of growth. Perhaps space exploration is the portal to the planetization of mankind, a concept the great French philosopher Teilhard de Chardin talked about in his writings, and to this new golden period of growth and advancement. I end with the following quote extracted from the writings of Shawi Effendi from his collection of letters entitled The World Order of Baha'u'llah. In this next slide at the top, you see the emergence of a world community, the consciousness of world citizenship, the founding of a world civilization and culture should, by their very nature, be regarded, as far as this planetary life is concerned, as the furthermost limits in the organization of human society. Though man, as an individual, will, nay, must indeed, as a result of such a consummation, continue indefinitely to progress and develop. Thank you so much for your attention.
Wow. Thank you. That was astonishing. The minute I saw your map of the just part of the Milky Way with our solar system, you are here, I was reminded of Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, yes. The total perspective vortex. And then you just went on to show us how we were even less significant than we thought. And yet, by looking from outside, make us realize that this handful of dust really could be in unity and needs to become so.